Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا باسم مبادئ أممية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال،
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It is the 20th of November 2023, and we are coming to you with a live stream today updating on news from around the world. And before I begin, I will do a bit of advertising, and I'll point you in the direction of the Class Consciousness Project YouTube page and website and social media channels. Because that's carrying a lot of the information about the event that myself and the comrades from the project, together with comrades from the CPGBML, attended over the weekend, which is the Merseyside Red Book Fair. I was there with comrades Chris and Rick, and you can find the speeches of Chris and myself up on the Telegram page. So I would encourage everybody to check that out. It was a very good event. My thanks to the comrade who put that on. So first things first, let us run through those who are in the discussion group today. So we have Jerry all the way from Hampshire down south. In England, we have Tom Browning over from Gloucestershire. We have Peter, my fellow resident of Perfidious Albion. And Jerry, glad you enjoyed the speech I gave at the book fair on Saturday. That's on the Class Consciousness Project YouTube page. And good morning to Paul over in Sydney, who's about to go to bed. So good evening, in fact, to you, or perhaps it is even good night. And good morning to my comrade Rick from the Class Consciousness Project, who's watching over there in Scousland with Tommy, the 2-year-old revolutionary. Good morning to you both, good sirs. And we also have Shanika McAdams in the chat as well. Good morning to you. So be sure to like and share the stream across your regular social media platforms if you haven't done so already. There's the matter of the Argentine election to discuss. There's also the meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden and what that means or what it doesn't mean. So there's also the ongoing war in Ukraine to get to as well. But we will begin by looking at the events in Argentina and the victory of the so-called libertarian, though actual American libertarians doubt that, Javier Milei. Now, I've discussed Milei before on the program, and he won all states in Argentina. But Buenos Aires and one other, I believe, and he got a majority, a vote of 55.69% compared to the 44.3% for Sergio Massa, who's the candidate of the incumbent sort of rather bland centrist bourgeois left party, essentially, who's been the successor. He's the successor candidate for the frankly, rather uninspiring government that has been in power for the last few years. That came in with great promise following the wave of opposition to the previous ultra-reactionary president, Mauricio Macri. Now, to understand Milei's victory, again, you have to look at the history here. Now, Milei himself, I'll come to in a moment, but his victory really is a failure of the various different Peronist and left Peronist projects that have run since at least the year 2000. Now, in the early part of this century, in 2001, the Argentine masses rose up and managed to overthrow the government of President Fernando de la Rúa, who was essentially making the Argentinian working class pay for the costs of the massive external debts owed by Argentina that had been racked up by various governments, and most exorbitantly by Carlos Menem, who's now, of course, long dead, but who racked up an awful lot of debts in the late 80s, early 90s, following the exit from military rule. And, of course, the traditional way in which the bourgeoisie seek to get payment on those debts is to attack the wages, the living standards of the working class. And this got to the point where it became unbearable, and there was a full-scale rebellion against President de la Rua and his finance minister, Domingo Carvalho. And de la Rua had to flee from the presidential palace from the roof via helicopter, memorably enough, following Carvalho's earlier resignation. And this ushered in a period of, chaos initially. I think there was something like 4 presidents in about a week. And then eventually Nestor Kirchner emerged, who was a left Peronist who became sort of the founder of his own tradition, he and his wife, Christina, called Kirchnerism, which is essentially a breakaway of the Peronist political tradition. And under him, following that, his wife's presidency, there was a period of economic growth and with inequality slightly shrinking. And this lasted the 2000s roughly until after the 2008 recession, when things started to turn negative again. Now, the point about the enormous amount of external debt, and I think I'm going to do a separate program on the Argentine debt problem. So I'm going to skirt over some of the details for now. The external debt, which, as Michael Hudson pointed out in one of his more perceptive articles and interviews, is owned by US what are called vulture funds, including one controlled by the horrific parasite Paul Singer. But also an awful lot of it is owned by the Argentine ruling class themselves, who buy this up essentially as to do 2 things. First of all, you're guaranteed, almost guaranteed anyway, to receive payments on a country's debt, especially if it's your country's debt, given the amount of political pressure that the Argentine ruling class can exert. And the whole question of payment on the debt is, of course, fairly easier to address if you're living in the country concerned. So the parasitism that the enormous amount of debt has bred within the Argentine system is enormous. Not only are they beholden to institutions of US imperialism, including, of course, when Singer was able to take Argentina to a New York court to insist on payment on the debts that he'd bought up, but also the fact that the parasitic Argentine ruling class has bought up a lot of this and continues to insist on payment on these debts. Essentially, because the debt is so high, it's the debt to GDP ratio in Argentina is 85%. It is another means of control over the actions of the government. And this is true not just in Argentina, it is true in Ecuador. This is why the treacherous Moreno government took out more loans from the IMF. It is why Mauricio Macri, when he was president of Argentina, took out another 4 billion loan from the IMF. Why? To continue paying the interest on the previous loans. Again, as I've said, the debts owed to various different imperialist entities and also the Argentine ruling class, and also to indebt Argentina further to make sure that it was further controlled by US imperialism. These politicians who take out these loans are there to operate as principally the tools of imperialism and the tools of the most parasitic and the most reactionary and the most disgusting elements within the Argentine or any ruling class. And so this is the background. The brief period of success enjoyed by Kirchnerism has long gone. The opposition to Mauricio Macri that took place in late 2017, in December 2017, when there was a general strike in Oh no, there was a general strike in 2018, and there was huge protests in late 2017 in Argentina that helped destabilize the Macri regime. However, this was channeled back into another vote for the left, the Peronists, and the Peronists presided over a government of stagnation and decline. And the poverty rate in Argentina is around about 40%, and that's according to data from the Argentine government and from the World Bank. You can find that fairly easily online. The unemployment rate is, officially speaking, only around about 7%. But what you have in Argentina is a worrying, shall we say, predictor of things to come potentially for all of us, which is you have a relatively low official rate of unemployment, but the wages are being forced down relentlessly year upon year upon year. Poverty is growing. The number of children in poverty is growing dramatically. And so after various swings and roundabouts, but after years of rule by Kirchnerism and Peronism with a brief period of Macri, is it any wonder that when a guy comes along in the form of Milei, who is a complete con man, let's just get that out of the way first, everything he says is bullshit. His policy prescriptions will lead to ever more misery for working class Argentines. But when he comes along and bangs the table, waves a chainsaw around, does all crazy shit, and says they're all crooks, chase them all out, it's not a surprise that even amongst poorer working class people that gets an echo, that it gets picked up. And he is, of course, also, Milei, to come to him now properly, he is a pure product of Argentine ruling class politics, and also is a product of the finishing schools of US imperialism. It's been pointed out that he's, of course, a graduate of various programs run by the World Economic Forum, and that shouldn't be a surprise when it comes to things like the WEF, Bilderberg Group, Council on Foreign Relations, all of these think tanks and influencing operations. These are all ultimately tied to the US imperialist world order, and they ultimately operate as think tanks, influencing operations, and finishing schools for politicians. For instance, David Lammy, the shadow foreign secretary here, is heavily involved in Bilderberg Group meetings. Why? Because the Bilderberg Group was set up post-World War II in order to push the influence of American imperialism, principally in Europe, but other areas of the world as well. And it's a place where the ruling class get together to essentially train politicians, to have private meetings with them, that kind of thing. And for grovelers like David Lammy, Keir Starmer, Javier Milei, being invited to these things is akin to a ticket to the promised land itself, because it's you're chosen by the ruling class, you're promoted within their networks, you're given an expense account, you're given all the things and that you would not get in any other way, at least not in any other way that your talents would allow you to, and you'll become a chosen man of the system. Now, Milei has been, catching eyes for sort of his various sort of eccentric performances. The fact that he's apparently cloned his dead dog, that he hears voices, he waves a chainsaw around, goes nuts, and he reminds me very much of the likes of Bolsonaro. Earlier on, the likes of the slightly more stable people like Berlusconi, and when you look at these characters and you look at what they actually stand for, the eccentric style, the over-the-top way in which they present themselves, like Milei with the chainsaw and everything else, and Bolsonaro and something he shares with Milei, which is the rabid support for Israel. And you look at all of that and sort of the faux macho posturings of what are transparently very, very weak men. Bolsonaro and Milei, very, very weedy characters on every single level, both the physical and the spiritual, should we say? And this over the top performance is all part of the act, because What does Milei actually stand for? He stands for essentially the unrestricted rule of U.S. finance capital in Argentina. He stands for the unrestricted rule of the global monopoly system, run of course, out of the U.S. imperialist capitals. He stands for wholesale attacks on the Argentine working class and its organizations. He stands for the use of the Argentine state to bludgeon the working class into submission. All of the stuff about anarcho-capitalism and all that shit, it's bollocks for a start. There's no such thing as anarcho-capitalism. I mean, I don't care how many people want to reference Murray Rothbard. Anarcho-capitalism isn't a thing. It can't exist. Capitalism and the capitalist state come into existence together. Their existence is inseparable, you know? The state formation and capitalism develop dialectically together. They are wrapped around each other like two strands of DNA, constantly interacting with each other. If you look at the history of capitalism in any country, and we'll use Britain as our brief example here, the way in which capitalism develops from its earliest possible period and the way that the English and then the British state develop constantly interact with each other. The economic base might be the starting point, but then it interacts with the structures of the state. It changes the structures of the state. The structures of the state then interact back with the economic base again, further changing that, and then the cycle repeats itself. So this idea that Rothbard and other theorists like to play with, that there's some sort of way in which you can have there's zero state, is a lie for anybody who, for the benefit of who might believe that. You don't get capitalism without a state structure, and a very strong state structure at that. Milei is not going to do away with the Argentine army or intelligence services or the police or any of the repressive apparatus of the Argentine state. He's not. He's actually said he's not. This anarcho stuff is just guff. It's salesmanship. It's image management. It's the way in which he presents himself as the man who's going to tear up the system. What he's going to tear up is any bit of the Argentine state that still exists as a concession to the working class. He's going to tear up any agreement that the working class has through its organizations with the state and the employers. He's going to try and let the employers completely off the leash. He's going to use the state and its organized forms of violence to crush any workers that resist. That's what he's going to do. He's dressing it up in all of this sort of over-the-top stuff because that's what you have to do when your program is essentially that you are going to let the ruling class and the American imperialist despoil the nation and essentially rampage and pillage across it in an unrestricted fashion. You have to adopt a massively over-the-top style and an eccentric way of presenting yourself, essentially as a gigantic means of covering that up. So Milei's program is straight from Wall Street. It's straight from the most parasitic elements of the Argentine ruling class. The eccentricities are all there to disguise that. The Israel obsession with that both he and Bolsonaro share is, of course, a bit of an odd one. It is explainable, though. It would be similar to like an obsession with Rhodesia or apartheid South Africa in like the 60s or the 70s. It's a way of pledging allegiance to U.S. imperialism without openly waving the stars and stripes. And, Israel and Zionism likes to portray itself as this sort of macho entity, which if you've been following our coverage of the Gaza war and the war on Palestine, you can see that it's very much not the case. It's weediness dressing itself up. You get the obsession of the Zionists with like strength and like how tough we are. We're dropping cluster bombs on children. But you also, the flip side of it is always, and if you've heard our discussions of Frantz Fanon, you can see that this is a very common thing. Zionism's obsession with strength, the obsession with domination and all that. The flip side of it is like the Zionists operate in fear and horror and like constant terror at being surrounded by people they are absolutely horrified, are stronger than them and will be able to overcome them. And the settler colonial societies like the Zionist state are always predicated upon this like horrible fear of their own weakness and the fragility of their own position that they cover up with overly macho statements. So for like rabid lunatics like Milei and Bolsonaro, who are just, the servants of the most parasitic elements of the ruling class, adopting like a Zionism makes complete sense, as it fits in with the rest of the way in which they present themselves. So anarcho-capitalism, not a thing. Milei, a complete stooge of US imperialism, dressed up in various eccentric forms. But what about his opponent? What about Sergio Massa? Now, here we run into some interesting forms of discussion because, of course, the Argentine ruling class themselves do appear somewhat divided upon Milei and Massa. Now, Massa was actually offering a government of national unity to the Argentine bourgeois. He was offering a national unity government with the right wing. Now, that's something which hasn't really been emphasized, but it is something that is true. So Massa was running a compromised operation, essentially. He was part of a compromised government. He's not the current president. I think he's the finance minister. So the way in which, again, to revisit what we previously said, the way in which the Peronist and Kirchnerist governments have run since 2000 is one that, though it initially enjoyed some success, and a lot of like the petty bourgeois left in the imperialist countries got very excited about it. I remember Naomi Klein going on and on about how it was great that there were so many worker-owned operations in Argentina. And worker-owned operations did grow for a while in Argentina because so many petty bourgeois and bourgeois owners of various businesses abandoned them, and then the workers took them back over again and started operating them, leading to protracted legal battles. But is there a revolutionary process underway in Argentina? The same way you can quite definitely say that one is and has been underway for a long time in Nicaragua or Venezuela or Bolivia as well. And the answer to that has to be no. For all the experiments in worker-operated business or worker-operated shops in Argentina, there's never been the kind of direct worker control over neighborhoods, over certain aspects of life that there are in Nicaragua and Venezuela. There's no equivalent, as far as I know, to the very extensive workers' assembly and workers' council system that does exist in Venezuela, and a similar thing that exists in Nicaragua, where the working class are able to exercise elements of rule over the state or certainly over their local area. And it is the Bolivarian movement's strength within the masses and the ability of the masses to not just mobilize but exert power within the state, even though you have essentially a situation where you still have capitalism existing in Venezuela and Nicaragua, but that is counterbalanced. The power of the ruling class is counterbalanced by the organization and mobilization of the masses through these organs of workers' power. And that means that in both of those countries there is a clear revolutionary process going on, even if capitalism still exists there. Now, ultimately, that contradiction will have to be resolved, and we can hope that it is resolved in favor of the working class, of course. But the reason why Ortega in Nicaragua and first Chavez, now Maduro in Venezuela survive is because of that role that the masses play. And the reason why the masses in both countries are willing to endure hardships and battle through them is because they are directly involved in a project that is at least moving towards socialism, however many twists and turns that takes. The masses will bear up under great suffering if they are able to see progress in front of them, if they are, and even with all the difficulties facing Venezuela and Nicaragua, there has been continual progress in the social position and economic position of the working class and the peasantry in both countries, which is why they embrace the Sandinista government and why they embrace the Bolivarian revolution to this day. That process has not occurred in Argentina. There were experiments with workers' control. There were elements of it, but it never crystallized in the same way that you get in Venezuela and Nicaragua. And also in Bolivia, where you, of course, have a long history of militant working class and indigenous rebellion that ultimately brought Evo Morales to power. So when he was couped out in a CIA-organized operation a few years ago, and they brought in Áñez to be the coup leader, the continual resistance of the workers and peasants of Bolivia made sure that that government didn't last too long. It was forced to hold elections, and then ultimately they forced out Áñez, brought in Luis Arce, and then they're getting rid of Arce and they're bringing back Morales. So you can hope that that further embeds the revolutionary process in Bolivia. But, and again, I emphasize, in Argentina, these processes were not going on in the same way. They were nowhere near as extensive. The revolutionary process started and stopped 20 years ago, and the whole thing got diverted purely into bourgeois electoralist channels. The same thing, by the way, happened in Brazil. Like in Brazil, there were all kinds of experiments with similar kinds of things that were going on in Venezuela, but they were isolated. They didn't have the same relationship with the Workers' Party in Brazil that the Workers' Council movement in Venezuela or Nicaragua does with the governments there, where they have a direct link to those governments and are able to exercise a means of control over what goes on there. And the government is defended by the masses and has to listen constantly to the masses. That is not the case in Brazil or Argentina, partly because I think that the ruling classes in Brazil and Argentina are much more powerful, and also Chavez and Ortega and Maduro are much more revolutionary figures than Lula is in Brazil, or that Kirchnerism ever was in Argentina. And so you have a different setup there. In Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, you have a revolutionary process that is underway in all of those countries where the masses are involved. Brazil and Argentina, it's different. Brazil and Argentina, the masses are not as involved. You get the masses periodically come onto the scene in the form of mass strikes, mass protests, but the Peronist parties and the Kirchnerist organization in Argentina does not have the same relationship with the Argentine working class and peasantry that others in South America do. And that is the fundamental weakness, I think, of what has gone on in Argentina over the last 20 years. It's, for all the revolutionary potential in the masses, you have these reformist politicians who are seeking alliances with the ruling class whilst not doing anything to actually build working class power, to actually involve the workers directly in an ongoing project to transform the country, which is what you have elsewhere. Same in Brazil. In Brazil, a similar process went on when Lula had his first 2 terms, stepped aside, and then you got the troubles that ultimately resulted in the overthrow through a judicial coup sponsored by the US of Dilma Rousseff. Now, that is, of course, true in terms of the role that the US imperialism played there. They decided that they wanted to get a more pliable candidate in there. Of course, what they ended up with was Bolsonaro, who was a rather unstable figure, and the bourgeois, or elements of the Brazilian bourgeois, got buyer's remorse over him. But the problem in Brazil, and I remember this debate happening in Britain 10 years ago, was that the way in which that the PT government had organized itself was as a purely reformist operation. There was, again, elements where the what's called the social movements had some influence there, but Lula and then Dilma and Lula again now are running something which is a much more traditional social democratic operation, with all the problems and the flaws and the weaknesses that that brings with it, including the fact because you're not engaging the masses permanently, you're essentially relying on them as voters and as people who will periodically turn out for you on a demonstration. They're not involved. They're not engaged in the process of building a new society, which is what they are doing elsewhere. They are passive a lot of the time. And therefore, the relationship with the government breaks down, as it broke down in Brazil, with large elements of the working class turning against Lula and Dilma and falling prey to the demagoguery and the manipulations of ultimately a Bolsonaro figure, who emerged saying many of the same things as Milei does, which is they're all corrupt, damn them all, I'm the guy who's going to come in, I'm the guy who's going to sweep the things clean, listen to me. Of course, it's bullshit. Bolsonaro was just a puppet of the most reactionary, most comprador elements within Brazilian capitalism. But he won an election with a lot of working class votes behind him. He also won every single major voting group other than the poorest in the last election, and Lula only narrowly defeated him. Now, all of this comes out of the fact that, again, I will repeat the point I'm making here, that where you have that more traditional social democratic politics, which you have in Argentina and Brazil, where there's an awful lot of compromises made with the ruling class, whilst at the same time there's no direct role for the masses. The masses are, at least some of them are, going to fall prey to demagogues when times are tough, when in Argentina it's undoubtedly the case that in many areas of the country, life has been objectively getting worse for many, many years. When you've got a 40% poverty rate, when you have unemployment only runs at 7%, but frequently the work that workers actually carry out just simply does not pay enough for them to live on. When you have like continual compounded misery and a deterioration of class consciousness across many areas of the country, what you are going to end up with is a Milei figure who's going to come along and con people into voting for him. Many people will be voting for Milei who will be the first to receive a kick from the Milei government when it lets the worst elements of Argentine capitalism off the leash. But to return to the point about the divisions in the Argentine ruling class, some in the Argentine ruling class were backing Massa, and they were also backing the idea of Argentine membership of BRICS, which it would seem that Milei is going to pull the plug on, because that's, of course, why his US backers were so keen on him. Now, whether he does or not is an interesting question. Bolsonaro was brought in to pull the plug on BRICS and didn't, ultimately because the whole question of BRICS membership was something that was not it was not going to be popular within even ruling class circles in Brazil to pull out of BRICS. And so Bolsonaro ended up in a sort of confused and compromised position where he wanted to withdraw from it, but there was too much ruling class opposition to getting out. Now, there is ruling class support in Argentina for going into it, but however, the comprador element, the pure comprador element of the Argentine ruling class seems to be stronger. So it would seem that Milei will at least try to pull the plug, and it'll be easier for him to do so because Argentina isn't formally in BRICS as yet. So this is a win for US imperialism, undoubtedly. But will Milei be the death of Argentina? Will he, as so many people are hysterically screaming, kill the country for good? I doubt it. I doubt it for many different reasons. I'm not going to say that Argentina is finished and all that. The Argentine working class survived the junta. They can survive this clown. who comes in at a time when US imperialism, for all that it still holds sway over a large chunk of the Argentine ruling class, is still a weakened prospect. So you've got a clown, basically, a buffoon, who is going to try all kinds of reactionary things. He's going to try and unleash a huge attack on the working class. But as always, and what a lot of these people don't see, who are sort of wailing about Milei's triumph, is that the working class itself gets a vote. The Argentine working class has successfully chased out one president in the last 20 years. There's no reason why they can't do it again, in theory. Now, in practice, that's rather difficult, but that it's been done in living memory that a ultra-reactionary president was chased out. If Milei tries to unleash all the forces of the state to crush the Argentine working class, now, of course, it's possible that he could do that, but it's also possible that he triggers an enormous response from Argentine workers to the point where, again, the state gets destabilized. So don't write off the Argentine working class. They've shown fighting spirit over and over again. The problem in Argentina is a problem of leadership. The problem is that Kirchnerism and Peronism, to me, seem like a dead end. They're not going to lead anywhere. Yes, it would have. If I were in Argentina, I might have voted for Massa to keep Milei out, but Massa himself was a terrible candidate from an uninspiring government that had repeatedly done deals with the IMF. Now, here I will agree with something that Michael Hudson says, which is that what a government should do, if it was genuinely in tune with the needs of the Argentine masses, what it should have done is to say to the American imperialists and their own ruling class, well, we're not paying a single peso of this debt. It's an odious debt incurred by corrupt leaders like Menem and others. It has destroyed, trying to pay this off has destroyed the country for decades. We're not going to carry on anymore, and you can do all kinds of things to us. You can try and blockade us if you want. You can try and take out sanctions on us, but we're not paying it. And for the ruling class, well, you've got a choice. You can either give up your attempts to extort this odious debt out of the country, or we can go in the opposite direction, and we can go to the masses and say, these are the people who have been extorting and trying to get blood out of a stone over the last 20 years. Why don't we seize all their assets? Now, of course, these are political risks. If you do that kind of thing in a country like Argentina with a long history of coups and severe repression and of a ruling class which is prepared to use military force to defend itself, yeah, you're taking a big risk, which is why you can't just do these things off the top of your head. If you're going to make those kind of moves, you need to have the strong and unified support of the working class and peasantry behind you. You need the masses, not just the working class and peasantry, but you would also need to get a significant section of the lower petty bourgeois along with you, which if you unified the working class and we unified the peasantry behind you, you would pull a large section of the lower petty bourgeois along with you. To do those kind of things, to survive the kind of siege that the US imperialists would try to throw upon you and the kind of maneuvers that the Argentine ruling class would try, you would of course need the masses unified behind you and mobilized in a significant way. You would also need to start at the very least a revolutionary process that would be akin to what the Sandinistas and the Bolivarians are doing in Venezuela and, of course, Nicaragua, or what the masses in Bolivia have been doing. But it cannot be the case that the Argentine workers have to continue to choose between these lame dead-enders from Peronism and Kirchnerism or maniacs who are in the pay of US imperialism. And further on the point regarding Milei's dollarization plan, I mean, dollarization is essentially just a complete surrender of monetary sovereignty over to the control of the US imperialists. I mean, the idea is ludicrous, but it comes from a man who, of course, is a dedicated servant to the US imperialism, so why would it be any surprise that he would pull this out of his arse? So this is not just a triumph of the most reactionary forms of the bourgeoisie in Argentina through their chosen vessel, Milei. It's also a complete failure of Kirchnerism and Peronism. They have driven themselves into a dead end because they have repeatedly tried to compromise with the ruling class in Argentina and with the American imperialists, and all it's led them to is the demoralization of the Argentine masses and the triumph of this ultra-reactionary who is able to come along and play the part of some sort of populist radical, despite the fact that that's exactly the opposite of what he is. And the fault has to be laid at the door of those who kept pushing down for electing more and more useless Peronist governments, which refused to mobilize the masses, which were afraid of the masses, and which kept trying to rule in this way where they were engaged in perpetual compromises with the ruling class without taking any action to balance this out through mobilization of the working class or in building at least a dual power situation in the country to counterbalance the power of the ruling class. So this is a disaster, yes, because it's going to lead to an enormous attack on the working class, but it needs to be fully understood as a failure of the Peronism and Kirchnerism, which is what it is. Ultimately, if Peronism and Kirchnerism were succeeding, there wouldn't be political space for a Milei, just as Bolsonaro wouldn't have gotten the time of day had the PT in Brazil been actually living up to what it was promising. Now, yes, it had made certain improvements, but it was still trying to rule in the same top-down fashion, not mobilizing the masses to any great degree. And what you got in the end was political space opening up, even amongst the working class, for a Bolsonaro. And this is what happens when social democrats, even in non-imperialist nations, try to rule in typically bourgeois fashion. They end up covering the worst of all options, compromising with the ruling class whilst demobilizing the masses, alienating the masses, and seeing a falling away of class consciousness either amongst the working class, either to the point where they become just demoralized, or some of them flip over out of anger and resentment and end up supporting reactionaries. This is the pitfalls of social democracy, no matter where it is practiced. Right, let's pause there. We have TD Mallard says, just back from Albania, would be interested in hearing your take on the communist era there. Well, we did a podcast on it ages and ages ago. You can find it in the archive, but I'm willing to revisit that in a video. Good morning to Red Star Betty. Stephen Newbury says anarcho-capitalism is just code for ultra-classical liberalism. It's a fraud. It's a cover story, basically. It's like the idea that, oh, well, we'll just remove all regulation. It's a fancy way of dressing up an enormous attack on the working class, basically. Good morning to CJ. And Philbin says, Peronism also seemed a uniquely syncretic version of class consciousness politics. Its fetish for fascistic aesthetics early on long confused me until closer examination. Yeah, Peronism's got various different strands to it. So it's got a right-wing strand to it. I mean, everybody in the Argentine presidential election, Milei, Massa, Bullrich, all had elements to their coalition that were from Peronism, because it's been many things to many men. So there's a left Peronist tradition. There's even a sort of revolutionary Peronist tradition. There's also a deeply reactionary one. It's all kinds of things. There was a genuinely progressive element to it that was very much worth supporting. There was there was even an armed wing at one stage in the 70s that was violently suppressed by the Argentine junta. So it's all kinds of things. But Perón himself, it was argued that he was a sort of fascist leader. I wouldn't say so. I would say that the the way in which he ruled had far more in common with what you might call populism, but ultimately Peronism ran out of steam and failed, and has failed again now. Good morning or good evening to Banana Bender, to Nikki K in Melbourne. Argentine exodus to Spain will continue. There will be some who just choose to up and leave. I mean, of course, having language in common will help. I imagine the Spanish capitalist class will welcome worker migration out of Argentina to Spain, but of course most people aren't going to be able to leave, nor would they want to leave. So I hope that the response to Milei is to revive and change the communist movement in Argentina, which we're all backing Massa's Union Patriotica, and I can understand the reasoning why, but in the inadequacies of this Peronism and Kirchnerism surely have to be faced now, given that there's no way that Milei should have won that election, because he's a transparent stooge and a transparent clown. The fact that he, and again, to go back to Bolsonaro, were able to win, the space opened up for them, not just in the petty bourgeois, but even within the working class, speaks to a deep failure of reformism in Argentina. Right, I'm going to move on now to talking about the meeting between Xi and Biden at the APEC summit over in San Francisco, California, following many months of the U.S. political leadership trying to secure a meeting with Xi, and the Chinese basically saying, well, what the hell's the point? You never abide by anything you say anyway. So the Americans seemed to be keen to get this meeting, though I'm not entirely sure as to what they thought they were getting out of it. I think that the more sensible elements within U.S. imperialism clearly understand that they need to at least manage their conflict they're trying to build with the Chinese. And this is probably what this was about. The Chinese themselves, though, turned up and essentially read off a litany of complaints with the U.S. side. Essentially, it's enough. They didn't say anything, and Xi didn't say anything to Biden that he's not said to Trump, and that he didn't say to Obama. If you look back, and this is why I would encourage you to read the speeches of Xi Jinping, you can see similar things being said all the way back to 2013, when he first emerges as General Secretary of the Communist Party of China and the President of the People's Republic. And in his first address to Obama, he says, well, we welcome President Obama to the meeting. We see no reason why we can't have a world of shared prosperity, why we can't cooperate together on vital issues, that America and China are two major powers, and that the world would be better if we could work in concert with each other, and that we don't want bloc confrontation. China does not seek to impose its model on anybody, but nor will we ever accept the US trying to impose any model on us or interference with our vital interests. Xi Jinping's been saying the same thing for 10 years, essentially. And he's been saying the same thing for 10 years to successive US presidents, because the policy of the American imperialists doesn't change. 10 years ago, there was the beginnings of what was then known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, this is an interesting thing. It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership was meant to be the latest free trade deal. Obama described it as the gold standard. It generated a lot of controversy, correctly, in the United States and elsewhere, because the unions in the United States said it was going to be all about furthering deindustrialization. And this was true. And Trump then picked up on it in a style similar to Ross Perot in the early 90s, and said that he was going to stop it, and he was going to stop this draining of jobs to China, even though China wasn't in it, of course. But Obama, being the cleverer representative of US imperialism, came up with the Trans-Pacific Partnership essentially as a means of containing China. Now, people say that, oh, well, the relationship with China deteriorated under Trump or it deteriorated under Biden. This isn't true. The actual relationship between US imperialism and the People's Republic of China is a lot more complicated and often contradictory than many people want to explore. For instance, even way back when Nixon and Kissinger did their first deals to recognize the PRC and make it or give it the official title of the official representative of the Chinese people at the United Nations, sort of displacing Taiwan, and even when they recognized the claim of the PRC over Taiwan, they whole way in which that was written. So, for instance, if you look at the acknowledgement of the One China policy, for instance, this is from the late 1970s under the Carter administration, you can see that when they first acknowledged that Taiwan is China, they left themselves a number of caveats in that recognition that would enable them to try and still exercise pressure on China via the relationship with Taiwan, should they choose to do so. For instance, the trading relationship, the provision of arms, etc. They left themselves room to move around that. And so, again, like, this isn't anything particularly new. The US ruling class was prepared to make an alliance with the PRC in the period of the later Cold War against the Soviet Union. Later on, they were very much involved with the events on Tiananmen Square, and I've covered before the mythology around that, but it was definitely the case that US imperialism was involved in attempts to destroy the system of government of the People's Republic of China and essentially get a Yeltsin figure in there. That was definitely what they wanted to do. They were ultimately thwarted because the CPC, for all that it had embraced or gone down the road of capitalist counter reforms in the 80s, still retained enough of a revolutionary faction within it, and there was still a strong section in there who were prepared to put the foot down and oppose outright capitalist restorationism. The whole question of that got presented in urgent terms in 1989. Unfortunately, the Chinese leadership were able to withstand that pressure, and a lot of the student leaders who were involved at the time ultimately fled through Hong Kong to the United States. So US imperialism was intimately involved with a real attempt to overthrow the PRC back in 1989. They couldn't do that. That failed, so ultimately US imperialism makes an accommodation. In the 90s, Clinton grants China the most favored nation status, backs its entry into the WTO because, first of all, US imperialism sees potential for exploitation of Chinese labor and for using the industrialization of China to reduce the costs of commodities that need to be brought into the United States, and also exploit Chinese labor in order to deindustrialize at home, though it should be principally said that the majority of the deindustrialization in the United States, so some of it came through automation, more of it came through jobs going to Mexico than it did to China. But US capitalist class was keen on exploiting Chinese labor and, of course, to stretch their supply chains over there because it was more profitable to do so. So they were prepared to make these compromises in the 1990s, and they weren't the first imperialist power to do that. Britain had, of course, invested heavily in the United States and, of course, in Germany all the way through the 19th century. And these ultimately grew into the replacements and the rivals of British imperialism. Now, the US invested in China always with the idea, ultimately, that their investments there were going to secure not just short-term profits, though of course that's very important, but also long-term change within China itself. The strategists of US imperialism, when they're looking at the relationship with China, and Clinton himself said this many times, and it was in the 90s about how engagement with China would change China and it would encourage democratization. For democratization, read full capitalist restoration. And the British were quite clear on this as well. One of the reasons why they were keen to continue doing business with China was the fact that they were very much involved in the process of not just making money there, but also the idea that by building trading relationships there, by encouraging the growth of capitalist relations in the PRC, that ultimately a capitalist class would grow up there that would be able to fully take power in China, and therefore you would get full capitalist restoration. That's what the British and the Americans meant when they said, oh, well, by engagement we'll move towards democratization. What they meant was, by encouraging the growth of a Chinese capitalist class, we'll get to full capitalist restoration. That's what part of their motivation was. Excuse me. So their plans ultimately didn't work. The way in which the 2000s played out ultimately ended in the disastrous collapse in 2008 for U.S. imperialism and its Western European vassal states. And it's really after that the intensification of hostility towards China follows on. And it's in that period that Obama does the so-called pivot to Asia, because they realized that this idea that they were going to be able to, through growing a Chinese capitalist class, encourage full capitalist restoration in China, this idea isn't going to work, or at least it's not going to pay off in the way that the US needs it to. Because even though US capitalism is making a lot of money doing business with China, it's not enough to bail out US imperialism from the hole that it is now in. And we've discussed this many times when it comes to Russia. But with reference to China, the US ruling class suddenly becomes worried that they are losing out to the Chinese now, that the Chinese are now building stronger and better trading relationships with many countries that used to be solely dominated by US imperialism. And so they then seek to restrain the rise of China. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was one way of doing that, in that the idea was they were going to encourage the capital flow out of the United States, but into countries that were much more strongly aligned with US imperialism. So this means, of course, the places like Indonesia, they fought for a while that they were going to get Vietnam firmly in their column, but it turns out the Vietnamese steer their own course and aren't prepared to go along with the US imperialists, except when their interests dictate that it would be good to do a deal with the US. They're certainly not going to reignite the 1979 war with the Chinese on behalf of any US president. But they thought that they could, by encouraging American capital and Western capital to flow to Thailand to a degree, Vietnam to a degree, Indonesia especially, Malaysia, even little Cambodia for a while. They thought that that would be a way to drain Western capital away from China. Now, of course, in theory, the US government could just put up giant barriers to capital investments in China, but they're not going to do that because they still need the cheap commodities that come from China and are sold in the United States. It's a means by which, of course, following the old tradition of British imperialism, you manage to continually suppress wages inside the imperial core by getting your commodities that are needed in an ultra-cheap fashion. So it can be sold at places like Walmart, so people can still maintain a certain standard of living despite the fact that their wages have been continually suppressed, because you get certain commodities from elsewhere in the world where they are much cheaper to produce. This was the trick used by the British imperialists in the 1850s and 60s, whereby they suppressed the price of food due to they were able to do that due to their control over the world market, whilst at the same time suppressing wages in Britain. So even though wages were suppressed and you actually ended up with even wage cuts, the price of food went down quicker, and therefore they were able to get away with both for a while. Same principle applies with the US imperialists. It's why they can't cut off relations with China completely, even though they were trying, even from 2009 to 10, to suppress the rise of China, all ineffectually, as it turned out. And so when you look at why Xi Jinping has been saying the same thing over and over again to multiple US presidents, it's because multiple US presidents have been in charge of policies that have been all about restricting the further rise of the Chinese economy and state. And so Obama's method was TPP, which were killed by the internal contradictions within the US state itself. So it became a political issue, and then Trump killed it off. It wouldn't have worked anyway. But then you get the Trump trade war, again, about restricting the development of China. And then you get the various Biden chip wars and their complete and total failure. The idea being that they were going to be able to restrict the way in which that the Chinese were developing high-tech production, because of course the advantage that the imperialists wanted to keep for themselves was that China was supposed to be a workshop where cheap commodities were made to be sold in the West. It wasn't supposed to develop in such a way as to gain a technological edge over the United States and the Western European vassal states of the United States. The way in which this was supposed to work was that the ultra high-tech production that relies on a very strong scientific base was supposed to be kept in the West, and all the basic stuff was supposed to be done in the East. So when China starts developing its own capacity for the building of very high-tech, like quantum computing and things like that, their ability to produce these microprocessor chips domestically starts to increase. The US panics and tries to slap an embargo on to try and kill off Chinese progress here. And then, of course, the Chinese government, led by President Xi, declares that they're having this national campaign to overcome these restrictions. And now almost everybody is acknowledging that the Biden policy on the so-called chip wars has failed. The Chinese have developed their own domestic manufacturing capacity for this, despite the fact they had to go through a bit of a struggle to get there. They've got there. And so the US faces total failure on that front. Their attempt to restrict the development of high-tech manufacturing in China has failed. So now they've got a problem. So again, to reiterate why Xi's been saying the same thing, it's because all of these different various political leaders of US imperialism have all tried the same thing in different policy formats over the last, 15 years now, all of which have led to the same response and the same result, which is failure. And now they're faced with a problem in that they've got a war they're losing in Ukraine. They've got a war in the Middle East, which is not going well. And it's not going well on multiple levels for US imperialism and its Israeli colony. And now they're faced with the fact that they've created this situation of hostility with the Chinese, and they need to find a way to manage it. So essentially, Xi Jinping came over and he said at length to Biden and Blinken and others the same thing which he said to Trump and he said to Obama. He said it in a more direct fashion, it would seem. If you read the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement, and I'm just going to drop that statement into the chat so everybody can take a look at it. If you read it, the language is stronger than some of the speeches that Xi has given before. But it's not really that much different. It's basically saying the same thing, which is that we as the Chinese government and the representatives of the Chinese nation don't seek rivalry with you. We only seek to develop ourselves. We don't seek global domination. We will not engage in colonialism and looting of other countries. We only seek trade. We will not impose our system on anybody. And of course, Biden, whoever the hell was running Biden's earpiece, responds by saying, "Oh well, we don't really want confrontation. We don't really want to break the one China policy. We don't really seek rivalry with China or a Cold War and all of those things." And the statement ends, the Chinese statement, by going on about how we're going to cooperate on climate change and AI development. drivel, mostly, from the American side. Because, of course, even though the Chinese say in their readout that Biden agreed on not violating the one China policy or not going towards a new Cold War, all of that is a lie. I mean, the Chinese know very well that the pressures inside American imperialism push them only in the direction of trying to trigger conflict now, because all of their economic policies regarding trying to stymie the rise of the Chinese economy have failed. And when the Chinese say that, well, our rise is not meant to be a threat to you, this is something we should unpack a little, because it's worth just emphasizing what this means. Now, the Chinese ability to now they can certainly outproduce the US when it comes to industrial capacity. Their ability to do that is without question. They can now, of course, start to rival the US when it comes to ultra high tech production. There's arguments that they're already being able to surpass them. On every level economically, the Chinese are pushing ahead and going past the United States. Now, Chinese say that this isn't a threat, but it is to US imperialism, because, again, read into the Chinese text. The Chinese text on their Ministry of Foreign Affairs site says, we do not seek domination, we do not seek to become a colonial power, and all of that is true. But simply by existing and trading with African nations, with South American nations, with other Asian nations, on the basis of not doing that, they become a threat to US imperialism, because US imperialism and its bloc allies, all of their business model is based on, of course, neo-colonial domination, as we've discussed before, and, of course, the pillaging and destruction of whole countries in order to enhance the wealth of the imperial core. Now, it is the Chinese being able to offer various different bargains and deals to countries like Uganda, countries like Mali, to a large extent, to an increasing extent, the Sahel countries. All of that, it becomes a threat to imperialism, because imperialism's whole way of doing business, as I say, is based on looting and destruction. It's not based on building anything. It's not based on generating anything positive. I mean, just look at how they behave towards nations in the Caribbean, for instance. And because the Chinese, even though they are not, the 1920s Comintern, by far from it, as they say, the mere fact that they are out there offering these better arrangements to various different nations removes the advantages that US imperialism has for itself. And so when people say that, oh, well, Xi Jinping went and he met with all these Wall Street guys and they all loved him and wanted to continue doing business. Well, yes, they do. All those characters who went to the meeting that Xi Jinping addressed and says, we want to continue to work with you, all of them look at the profit margins they make from doing business in China and they all want to see it continue. Does that mean that US imperialism is not going to essentially still try to derail Chinese growth and to ultimately push for some kind of military confrontation with China? The pressures all push US imperialism in that direction, regardless of what a room full of CEOs think. Because let's then broaden out our analysis and look at, with regard to US imperialism as an entity, where does its advantages come from? Where does imperialism's advantages come from? Higher technology is one, of course, area, but it's the ability to extract those what are referred to as super profits from the hyper-exploited neo-colonial nations of the world. That's where imperialism's advantage comes from. And if it can't have that anymore, then it plunges into crisis. Now, all these Wall Street firms and these tech firms that are doing business in China, that are wanting to continue, they will all get overruled, because what many of these CEOs perhaps don't understand about their own businesses, about their own position in the global economic system, is that the likes of BlackRock, Vanguard Group, Goldman Sachs, etc., all the oil companies, all the big names in the sphere of American capitalism, all of their abilities to extract profits is all fundamentally based on the imperialist model. If that imperialist model is damaged in the sense that the ability of the Chinese to promote in the independent development of the countries that have been subjected to neo-colonialism, if those countries develop to the point where they are able to either drive a much harder bargain with the imperialists or just don't need the imperialists anymore or maybe that's the wrong way of putting it, or are able to say no to the imperialists, say, you know what, we're not allowing you in here to operate this mine, not unless you agree to the following conditions, not unless you agree to, for instance, a good example would be Burkina Faso, where their industries that have been so-called invested in by the French imperialists over the years, it was all about extracting resource out of the country. So one is, I believe, the sugar industry in Burkina Faso, or in Niger, it's the extraction of uranium. What imperialism does in countries where it extracts resources, it doesn't build up like a coherent industrial base. What it does is it builds up an extraction industry, and then it extracts and it extracts and it extracts, makes a lot of money in doing so, but it doesn't build up anything. So you end up with, like, at the very best, you end up with wildly uneven development in countries subjected to neo-colonial rule, where you'll get like a tiny area which is based around hyper-exploitative extraction of resources, and the rest of the country remains completely or mainly underdeveloped. If countries in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, Caribbean, are able to now embark upon a process of industrialization whereby they are no longer forced to accept these so-called offers from US imperialism and its European vassal states, if these countries are no longer able to extort super profits out of this hyper-exploitative model, just by the fact that the Chinese and increasingly the Russians offer them a different model to operate on, then that is a dire threat to US imperialism. Because what do they think? What do the people think is going to happen here? That US imperialism is just going to adapt itself to a loss in profits? No. The entire business model has now got a hole in it. And those Wall Street guys might not understand it for now. They might look at their profit margins from the business they do with China and think, well, why am I going to give up this? But without the ability of US imperialism to extract profits in the way they do now, the entire business model of the US empire goes down the plug hole. And it'll take the Wall Street guys with it in the end. They're tied to the US imperialist system completely. Just the same way, by the way, that British capitalism back in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s invested and invested and invested in the United States. And then when the Civil War came along, the British imperialist political leadership were very tempted to join in on the side of the South in order to destroy the North, a place where their own capitalist class had massively invested. Now, of course, they were also exposed to risks from the cotton trade being shut down in the South. But when it comes to the overall interests of imperialism, the role of the imperialist state is to secure the maximum possible advantage for the continuation of that imperialist system. And if that means that a part of the capitalist class has to take a bit of a hit in order to preserve the ability to generate super profits for the whole system, then that is what they will do. Same thing with Germany. The British capitalists invested an awful lot in Germany prior to 1914. Didn't stop the war because German capitalism, German imperialism, developed to the point where it was becoming a threat to the British ability to extract profit from its colonies across the world, which was vital for British imperialism. So again, just because a section of a capitalist class invests in a particular country that is rising and makes a lot of money in doing so, does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that it's going to restrict the overall plans of the imperialists to preserve their position by then trying to destroy the very country that some of their own capitalists, or a lot of their own capitalists, have invested in previously. Capitalism is a contradictory and often wildly destructive system that, again, its contradictions power it and destroy it. And so when it comes to a capitalist class investing in one area of the world, then realizing that they've invested, the thing that they have invested in is going to rise to the point where their whole business model is threatened, you can bet that they're going to do everything they possibly can to try and first restrict it and then try and destroy it. So the risk of war, the risk of the US imperialists trying to engage in or try to generate some kind of conflict to destroy the Chinese is still very much there, because all of their interests are now much more aligned to trying to destroy the government of the PRC and the leading role of the CPC, and of course, more further afield, trying to destroy the government of the Russian Federation. So because they need now to destroy a rival in China and to destroy two countries which, if the strong governments there that are able to exert independence are gone, then it leaves whole areas of the world open for rabid despoilation, and profitability can be restored to imperialism if these two countries are destabilized to the point where their governments are destroyed. That is the actual situation. Now, unfortunately, until imperialism is stopped, until imperialism is overthrown inside the continental United States and inside Britain and France and Germany, then this is going to continue. The Chinese, as they say, aren't exporting ideology anymore. Not really. Not in the same way that the Comintern did back in the day. And so the actual reality is that if you want to stop this destructive process that is underway, then the only thing that we are going to be able to do to stop it is to overthrow imperialism in our own countries. That is the only way that this stops. Otherwise, they're just going to keep going down this route. Nobody from outside is going to roll the tanks in and save us. And this is a curse of the Western left going back all the way to the days of the Soviet Union. There was, part of the appalling mistakes of revisionism was the complacency that it bred. The idea that the Soviet Union was there and would always be there as this center of revolution was one that was embraced by certainly the revisionists in Britain. And then, of course, when it weakened through revisionism inside the USSR itself and then disappeared, none of these people knew what to do anymore. So to re-emphasize, nobody is coming from the outside to save us. Multipolarism is not going to save us either, because that is just a stage upon the road of the dismantling of the global US imperialist system. And the US imperialists are going to fight like tooth and nail to make sure that it is restricted, and that if there is a cost to be paid through the multipolar world emerging, that it is a cost they seek to inflict upon those they are still able to dominate through neo-colonial systems or the domestic working class. So the only way it ends is if it is ended inside the imperial core countries. People need to stop looking outside for an answer. The only answer is within. It's within the working class of the imperial core countries that the ability exists, if properly organized, to end imperialism. So, we have got more comments here. We have, Eduardo corrects my pronunciation of the new Argentine president's name. Milei, I think that's correct, is apparently the way I'm supposed to pronounce it. Hello to Zweibacher. Healthy Harold says the Trans-Pacific Partnership went hand in glove with Obama's pivot to Asia, correct. Zweibacher says, can you at some point make an episode with an overview of the different Trotskyist trends, where they come from and what differentiates them, noteworthy positions they take, etc.? Well, I may do that, but I suspect... Okay, well, let me know in the comments if you want to see that, or because I can do it, but I suspect it won't have a lot of interest outside of certain areas. But if there's an enthusiasm for it, I will do it. Hello to Randy W. over there in West Tokyo. Good evening to you. Philbin says, that's why the new joint front by capitalists of the left and right against the PRC is so unconvincing. We in USA made a deal, now the imperialists demand and are reneging to punish China for succeeding. Well, yes, I mean, don't expect principles from the imperialists or to be able to stick by any agreement. Their system is in crisis. They're going to do whatever they think is necessary to preserve it. What restricts them at the moment is the sheer lack of industrial base themselves. They can't wage a war on the PRC or Russia because they simply don't have two things. They don't have the necessary industrial base to be able to do it. The war in Ukraine has massively exposed that. And, of course, they don't have the necessary political strength inside the United States or Western Europe to mobilize the population for a war. They just don't have it at the moment. Now, is it possible in the future that a fascist regime might be strong enough to try and do that? Yeah, it is. But they would face enormous challenges in the form of completely deindustrialized countries with hollowed out industrial bases. And if they wanted to get ready for some kind of war against countries with the most powerful industrial bases in the world, they would need years to catch up to it. And they don't have years. So that's something that is more in the favor of peace over conflagration. Hello to Damien in Dublin. Big Meanie says, off topic, what happens to the labour theory of value when everything is produced by AI? Well, that's a rather large topic. I'll add it to the question and answer list because there's a lot to say on that. I will come back to it in a future episode where we finally get to the Q&A for last month. Yeah, remind me of it if I don't come to it. Right. Okay, so I've been going for an hour and a half now. I think I'm going to leave it there for today, and then we'll come back to a Russia special tomorrow. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Again, check out the Class Consciousness Project's social media channels if you haven't done so already. And I will be returning to you again at around about the same time tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man.